Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Shama Sawant.
And I'm Kaylin Nicholson. Just over a month ago, auto workers at Volkswagen's plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee, won their union election with the United Auto Workers, or UAW, in a landslide victory of 73% in favor. On Strike brought you an exclusive interview with UAW International President Shawn Fain, in which he talked about how the union won at Chattanooga. You'll definitely want to check out that episode using the link below if you haven't already watched it. This victory makes Volkswagen the only unionized foreign-owned auto plant in the United States. This is a really big deal, and it's part of Shawn Fain and the UAW's public pledge to organize 150,000 non-union auto workers in the United States. Following this blowout victory, the UAW went on to the next union election at the Mercedes-Benz plant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This time, however, the UAW lost the union election, with 56% of the votes against unionizing. Working people and the UAW need to analyze what went right and what went wrong and apply those lessons in order to restart the fight to unionize the Mercedes-Benz plant and to have the most effective strategy going forward in the fight to unionize other non-union auto factories, most of them located in the South. In both the labor movement and in social movements, we need to soberly assess the lessons from both our victories and our setbacks. To help us make sense of how and why the UAW won in Chattanooga but lost in Tuscaloosa, we're lucky to be joined today by Logan Swan. He's a journeyman ironworker of Local 86 and a casual longshoreman represented by ILWU Local 19. Logan is also a member of Workers Strike Back.
Before we hear from Logan, I want to remind you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you've been watching On Strike, you know that we bring coverage, political analysis, and strategy for the working class of the kind you simply won't find in the mainstream media. As Kaylin said, we brought you an exclusive interview with UAW President Fain in which we had an important discussion about the UAW victory in Chattanooga. But we also asked him questions labor leaders rarely get asked, like why, after having publicly called for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, the union leadership endorsed Biden, the warmonger-in-chief. Last year, when the UAW members who are auto workers at Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis were on strike, we brought you multiple episodes of ongoing coverage of the strike. We provided the kind of clear analysis of the strike and proposals on strategy for the way forward that working people need when they take on the billionaires. Become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to build our movement against the bosses and their political servants, and so that On Strike can continue to bring the kind of discussions about strategy needed to fight back and win. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people. Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. After you watch the interview, join us for the inaugural Workers Strike Back National Zoom Conference on the evening of Thursday, June 20th. We will discuss the strategy for ending the war on Gaza, building for protests at the Democratic National Convention, what working people should do in the presidential election, and why we need a new party. We'll have more details in the coming weeks, but for now, save the date. And now, Logan Swan will be joining us from Portland, Oregon. Welcome to On Strike, Logan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Can you tell us about the Volkswagen auto workers' huge historic victory last month in their union election at the plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee? And why do you think they were able to win a landslide victory?
So the Chattanooga plant is the first non-U.S. automaker to be unionized in the U.S. since the short-lived Volkswagen plant in Westmoreland, Pennsylvania, closed in 1988. That plant moved to Puebla, Mexico, but since then, so many foreign label automakers have set up shop in the South that it's now the region with the most auto plants in the United States. Since the 1980s, many of the American domestic auto plants shut down, and in their place came foreign corporations such as Toyota, which built its largest plant worldwide in Georgetown, Kentucky, with more than 8,000 workers. And BMW in South Carolina, Mercedes-Benz and Hyundai in Alabama, Kia in Georgia, joining Subaru, Toyota, Nissan, and Honda. Timothy Minchin, a history professor and author of a book called America's Other Automakers, has written about how the American South became a case of globalization, shifting capital and production from wealthy countries to poor areas of the wealthiest country. Today, these non-union plants account for about half of auto production in the United States, undermining wages and conditions in union plants. The victory in Chattanooga has the potential to start a chain reaction and to catapult UAW's effort to organize the rest of the auto industry in the United States, and especially in the South. The victory was inspired by the record gains that was won by last year's UAW strike of the big three automakers, just Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. Chattanooga workers won through bottom-up rank-and-file organizing. The Chattanooga Organizing Committee recruited an impressive 300 coworkers as election captains, and as reported in labor notes, they had well over 90% of coverage within the plant. So that's coverage in every position and on every line. So at Volkswagen, the victory was decisive, 2,628 to 985, meaning 73% of ballots were in favor of unionizing with the UAW. So of the 4,300 workers eligible to vote in the union election, 83.5% cast ballots. So this is both a tremendous margin and a tremendous turnout. That kind of breadth of support for a union election is important for workers and the union in winning major battles that still lie ahead, especially, winning their first contract, fighting for that to be a very strong contract. This victory is also significant given the serious opposition it faced both directly from the capitalist class and from the political establishment that represents the boss's interests. The governors of 6 southern states, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, led a fear-mongering campaign to demonize the UAW and the very idea of workers getting unionized. So they publicly accused the UAW of employing scare tactics. And they claimed that they, as elected officials, had, this is a quote from them, the responsibility to our constituents to speak up when we see special interests looking to come into our state and threaten our jobs and the values we live by. I think ask anybody in any state, do you feel represented by your governor? Do you think that these politicians care about, about your working conditions? I don't know. I mean, on the job sites I'm on, I'm in Oregon now. I usually work in Washington, and it doesn't matter. People hate their local politicians because they don't feel represented by them. These are the same people who were enacting things like NAFTA, from the same political parties, and for them to come along saying they care about our jobs is just absurd. And yeah, although forgetting who I'm talking to, of course, Chama is the only exception to that, to this longstanding rule of politicians being total sellouts for working people. The only politician taking the average worker's wage, who's actually leading campaigns for around working people's interests, right?
And you were, Logan, you yourself were involved in the Fight for 15 that we launched here, and we made Seattle the first major city to win it. And in fact, Seattle's minimum wage now is the highest in the nation, almost $20 an hour. And our viewers should know that Logan also played a very important role in our fight to win the Amazon tax, and in fact withstood real opposition from sections of the union leadership in the construction trade as well. Kaylin, you remember that?
Absolutely, yeah. Such a decisive victory in the face of that kind of widespread repression from the political establishment is really remarkable. So what did the UAW do differently in Tuscaloosa? Why did that union election result in a loss?
So I think a crucial difference in strategy in Tuscaloosa was that it didn't have the same kind of relentless, on-the-ground and in-person political organizing that rank-and-file workers did so effectively in Chattanooga. So which is not to say that they did not have it at all. As Jeremy Kimbrell, a veteran of 25 years working at the plant, said in a recently published Labor Notes article, workers played important roles in leading the campaign. But as Kimbrell says, the union campaign might have relaxed its on-the-ground organizing in the closing weeks, which is precisely when the company's union busting was the strongest. Labor reporter Mike Elk, author of the Payday Report, has also said in a recent article that his sense from talking to union organizers is that there was too much emphasis on a digital-heavy approach. So rather than using traditional organizing committee structures with lead workers and the union's organizers talking directly with workers to win them over to the union and explaining the boss's union busting maneuvers, the UAW relied heavily on digital meetings, a light staff approach from the International Union, and getting workers to sign union cards via QR codes rather than as an outcome of a strong political conversation that can turn each worker into a potential rank and file fighter for the union. Of course, there's nothing wrong with QR codes or using an online, having an online strategy, but they shouldn't be the main thing. There's no replacement for face-to-face organizing, which is ultimately the most important way to win over workers. This unfortunately partly cut off the union activists and the lead workers from the rank and file, and created an opening for the Mercedes executives to make a plea of, give us one more chance after the company disingenuously fired their plant manager in a fake show of listening to the workers. We have to remember that the capitalists, the bosses, their spokespeople, these people will use all kinds of tricks and tactics. When and where they can, they will use blatant union busting, like Amazon has been doing out at KCVG. But the boss's tactics are not always so direct or obvious, and when they think open attacks against the union will backfire, they will make these kind of, false apologies and engage in sweet talking. The working class can't give in to either the carrot or the stick. They need to buck the rider. There was a lot of positive media coverage of the UAW and the stand-up strike, and many UAW leaders thought their generally top-down approach to that fight could win this union drive at Tuscaloosa, instead of what they should have done, which is assisted workers in developing the kind of bottom-up, shop floor organizing that led to the blowout victory at Chattanooga. Those workers should have been brought to Mercedes-Benz to talk about their rank-and-file organizing, what they learned and how they won, how those lessons could be best applied in Alabama. At Mercedes-Benz, the UAW leadership was unfortunately a bit overconfident and didn't draw the right lessons from Chattanooga. The UAW charges that the company used backroom manipulation tactics against workers, and I have no doubt that that's true. They said that these tactics may still be illegal in Germany and could cause Mercedes to get into legal trouble. So all that may be true, but union organizing drives need to stay 2 steps ahead of the bosses, anticipate the possible moves from the company to try and undercut the union campaign, and be prepared with tactics and to escalate the campaign into the next stage. As Jeremy Kimbrell points out in his Labor Notes article, the Mercedes-Benz company, in order to take the wind out of the union drive, made concessions that the union leadership didn't anticipate. They ended 2-tier pay, which was a demand the union leadership had prominently campaigned for, and gave a $2 an hour raise. So I don't agree with Kimbrell's conclusion that perhaps the union pushed the 2-tier demand too much. In fact, winning the end of 2-tier shows the pressure that the company faced from the union drive. Kimbrell himself writes about how winning this concession, not surprisingly, increased support for the union drive. Such major concessions should be used to build further momentum for the campaign, winning over more workers into supporting the union. We should expect the bosses at non-union auto companies to try and prevent a union getting established by making even such big concessions to convince workers that they're better off without a union. Starbucks executives were able to undercut some support for the union in that company by offering seniority wage increases, electronic tipping, and benefits only to workers at non-union stores. And we should expect stuff like this. And the best defense is the strongest possible rank-and-file organizing that stands up to and answers the boss's attacks on the shop floor. Instead, the union ended up losing support in the face of manipulation and a disinformation campaign. Many workers bought into Mercedes' pleas to give them another chance and voted against the UAW. The union leadership was also caught off guard with the company's soft but dangerous anti-union tactics, including anti-union meetings that were very low-key backroom affairs that targeted specific departments. An insidious aspect of the company's union busting was the fact that they systematically conducted psychological profiles of workers and only invited quote-unquote persuadable workers to anti-union meetings, according to the Payday Report. Of course, even when everything is done right, not every working class campaign will win. There will be setbacks. As Sean Fain said, which I agree with, it is a David versus Goliath fight.
So, yeah, I think, Logan, you have laid out a lot of very important reasons for us to take into account and learn from why this union drive didn't succeed. What should our conclusion be as workers, as the working class? Should we feel disheartened by this setback? And what can we learn from this experience on the whole?
Getting back-to-back wins would have been incredibly powerful and would have retained the momentum that's needed. So, we shouldn't sugarcoat this, that it's a real setback. The single most important thing here is to learn the right lessons and to not repeat the mistakes going forward. Unions often, they do often try multiple times at a given work site before winning. So the UAW tried twice at Volkswagen in Chattanooga, both in 2014 and 2019, before winning big this year. And the workers in Chattanooga had seen the manipulative tactics from the bosses, like in 2019 when the company said, they were begging the workers to give this new CEO a chance. The Chattanooga workers were not about to fall for that type of falsehood this year. But this was the first time that Mercedes workers in Tuscaloosa had seen the company's manipulation, psychological profiling, the complex disinformation tactics. So this is not the end of the road in Tuscaloosa, but it's still a defeat, which we should be clear about and learn from. To draw workers in, Mercedes offered them time off the grueling assembly line to have them attend these anti-union meetings and ask the workers to give them another chance. If you've never seen that kind of about face from management before, it can be surprisingly effective, especially if the workers aren't prepared for it by really strong shop floor organizing that responds in real time. After months of these personalized meetings with plant workers, Mercedes performatively fired the plant manager. So the new manager went on a charm offensive and won still more workers over. This was unfortunately an effective maneuver, especially in the absence of an effective counter from the union leadership. Mercedes was sending the message that it was willing to change without bringing in the UAW, which predictably was painted as an outside union from Detroit, which would upset these new friendly, boss-employee relationships. According to the payday report, UAW Local 112 Vice President Kurt Garner believes that the union can come back for another election within a year or two. Garner says he and the 2,000 of his coworkers who voted for the union are willing to keep working. After all, the union only lost by just under 600 votes. Now, with time to build for a more traditional organizing committee, Garner feels confident that the UAW can win. In this context, we should also point out that many workers, including many Big Three auto workers, felt that the UAW did not win everything that it could have in last year's stand-up strikes. Workers had expected an all-out strike against every plant in the Big Three empire, as we saw from the responses when Shawn Fain announced on livestream that only a small number of plants would be affected initially. There was a sense of anticlimax by workers unhappy about this decision, which took weeks to recover from. And workers were right to be worried about the overly clever stand-up strike strategy, as it was called, which in reality demobilized a majority of workers from the strike. An all-out strike would have used the power of the entire workforce at all three companies, shutting down the profit-making machinery and putting intense pressure on the companies to settle and grant all of the demands being made. In particular, the demands on pensions and, equally importantly, retiree health care for all of the thousands of workers hired since those were given away during the Great Recession. This would have created a far bigger wave of support for the union's drive to organize the foreign label automakers in the South, and much more could have been won.
We can see how the bosses at the Mercedes-Benz plant used just really manipulative tactics at Tuscaloosa to beguile workers into voting no on unionizing. And as you said, I think we need to recognize that this is a form of union busting, plain and simple. Could you talk about some of the other forms of union busting that we commonly see from the capitalists?
The truth is that the vast majority of the time, union busting is much more open and brutal than what happened at the Mercedes plant. There's been a fierce counterattack by Starbucks, Amazon, Trader Joe's, and other companies in response to the wave of unionization efforts. And the billionaires have always used all their vast resources to try and crush union efforts by any means necessary, by whatever means they think they can get away with. And that's not determined, what they can get away with is not, what's legal or not on paper. It's what the workers are, organized, have the level of organization to put a stop to themselves, defending their own interests. And that's why, it's important for workers not to have these no strike clauses in the contracts. We have to maintain every weapon that they'll use against us. We have to maintain every weapon we can use to defend ourselves against their attacks. Among these union busting actions are retaliatory firings of workers. Amazon has fired many workers simply for unionizing. In February last year, a day after employees at a Tesla plant in Buffalo announced plans to unionize, Tesla wasted no time firing dozens of workers there. Apple Corporation has been accused of illegally spying on and threatening workers who were fighting to unionize. And another tactic is simply just closing down stores. Trader Joe's closed its one wine shop in New York City days before that shop's workers were going to announce plans to seek a union election. The owners of the Darwin's coffee shops in the Boston, Cambridge area in Massachusetts shut down the entire chain of stores in order to end the budding union campaign among its employees and to avoid setting a precedent for local cafes paying a living wage of $24 an hour before tips. These examples, which are of course costly for the bosses, are reminders of the very deep pockets of the wealthy and how they will spare no expense in trying to crush the working class fight back. As the Guardian newspaper wrote last year, the extraordinary recent wave of unionization has been met with an equally extraordinary wave of union busting, which is a reminder that not only are the bosses not our friends, they're vicious enemies of the working class. They recognize that every dollar spent on workers' wages, on benefits, on workplace safety is one less dollar for them. And they also recognize that workers' victories are contagious and that they don't want workers to set an example. They don't want workers to realize their real power in society, our collective power. Under capitalism, union busting and undermining of workers hardly stops even if workers manage to win the union. We know that. This is a bankrupt system run by the capitalists in their interests and only in their interests. Newly unionized workers in the last few years have learned that the fight back needs to keep going on. Workers have recently won unions in corporations like Starbucks, REI, Amazon, Apple, Trader Joe's, Chipotle, but none of those companies have relented yet on a first contract for these workers, let alone a contract in which the workers win substantial gains in wages, benefits, and working conditions. One of the things that companies do is to deliberately drag out negotiations. Even when these delay tactics are illegal, as are so many of their other tactics, the bosses do them all the time. And they'll continue to. They'll continue to get away with them unless workers mount a massive fight back, build a broader working class struggle, and take on the system itself. So far too often, union leaders actually prepare the way for this by lulling workers into a totally false sense that the company is going to, come around only if the union plays nice with them. We saw this at its worst in the early days of the Starbucks Workers United campaign, in which union leaders instructed member organizers to write letters to the boss, apologizing for unionizing and saying that they're doing it for the good of the company. This is it's scandalous, it's awful, but it actually happened. So here's one example, which was posted on the union's website in 2022. So Kevin Johnson was the CEO of Starbucks at the time. Dear Kevin, in solidarity with our fellow partners, we, the partners of Holman Road, Seattle, wish to inform you of our intent to organize a union. This is not a decision we take lightly, but after watching the events of the last few months unfold, our hearts have grown heavy. We no longer wish to stand beneath you, but rather alongside you, and ask for our voices to be heard. This is not a declaration of war, but an olive branch. We come to you as a store wanting to help.
It's a complete misconception, complete and utter misunderstanding of the boss and worker relationship, which is antagonistic by definition.
Also, the idea that the events of the last few months have caused their hearts to grow heavy, and that's why they need a union, as opposed to, the years of low pay and insufficient benefits and trying to keep paying rent as the housing market skyrockets. I mean, those are the real reasons why workers need to be fighting for and demanding unions.
Yeah, it's Saturday, here's the schedule for next week, and we put you on schedule even though it was supposed to be your day off, and fuck you if you can't.
Yeah, exactly.
So as for the auto industry, most of the major plants that are in play are in the so-called right-to-work states. Right-to-work is a tool that the bosses developed after World War II to try and keep unions out of the South. The South was rooted in the racist politics of the Jim Crow era, and you can see in the propaganda that was used at the time that it was based in the racist and sexist tropes against black workers. What right-to-work does legally is to financially weaken the unions by allowing workers to have some benefits of union protections without paying dues, but the damage it has done has been much broader than that. You also have the enormous pressure of the political establishment, which has handed out billions of dollars in tax breaks to subsidize these automakers to build plants in the South, and which continues through a network of right-wing governors to fight unionization every step of the way, using the threat that if they're unionized, these plants will simply close up shop and move somewhere else. And mind you, this is exactly what we heard with Tax Amazon and with the 15 Now campaign that we had in Seattle. Don't tax Amazon or they'll pack up and leave.
No, I was just actually remembering an interview that right-wing, pro big business conservative reporter did with me during that struggle. And she asked me repeatedly, are you willing to take the responsibility of if 7,000 workers lose their jobs? Meaning if Amazon shut up shop and left Seattle.
And of course, as I think we talked about in a past episode, there was the case with Boeing where the Washington state legislature gave them a historic tax break,
$9 billion
$9 billion, supposedly to stop them from moving jobs to right-to-work states. And then within 2 years, they had still moved something like 15% of their jobs out of state anyways, after taking the $9 billion.
Yep.
Oh, and at the time, the state legislature was being held in contempt by the state Supreme Court for criminally underfunding public education.
Exactly.
That's
and
right.
and this was a state legislature that was dominated by the Democratic Party, and the governor was a Democrat.
And this is why we need a workers' party. So the reshoring, protectionist economic strategies being embraced by both the Republican and Democratic parties mean that this threat is more hollow, less based in reality than at any time since these plants were built. But it still resonates because of the past history since the 1980s old worn out plants being closed down and the new ones built elsewhere, either Mexico, South Korea. And one of the many reasons to reject the plant closure narrative is the sheer newness of the investment in the southern auto plants. The cost of moving them would be on a different scale than that of replacing already worn out factories, like the one that Volkswagen closed in 1988, or any of the big three factories that have also been closed in the last 40 plus years. The worn out story does not apply at Mercedes, for example, where some of the most expensive cars in the world, such as the Maybach brand, are being built using up to the minute equipment. But of course, we should not underestimate that what the bosses are prepared to do, that they could still close down certain plants. And our best defense is to avoid isolation and spread our victories to more and more auto facilities, and also winning victories in other worker struggles and social movements.
That's right. You've been a union longshore worker for, I believe, 5 years and a union iron worker for 10 years. Talk about what union leadership you've seen as a rank and file union member yourself in the construction trades and the challenges you think there are to rebuilding a fighting labor movement.
Yeah, there's a very long history of union leaders losing touch with the interests of their rank and file members, getting comfortable in their roles in which they too often they see themselves as mediators between us as workers and members of the union and the bosses, rather than organizers leading us to fight for what we need and for the wealth that we create. In the process, these leaders become misleaders who award themselves salaries and fringe benefits that put them on a different level from the rest of us. They literally forget where they came from, or they're recruited from the outside of the ranks, whatever the case may be. And as time goes on, they develop undemocratic maneuvers to protect these privileges. So, for example, there's currently only a very small number of national unions in the U.S. Who elect their top leadership through direct elections. One member, one vote. The Teamsters and UAW only have this because of corruption scandals at the top, resulting in government monitors being imposed, creating the space for some rank and file struggles to break out. The American Postal Workers Union won it through a massive internal struggle around their illegal and also very successful and important strike in 1970. I mean, so with the Teamsters and the UAW only having this because the corruption scandals at the top resulted in government monitors being imposed. Although it's really important for people to understand, it was not the government that created this, this change toward a more democratic representative union, but rather it was the rank and file. That there was this space created for the rank and file to initiate these struggles and to lead these struggles. And yeah, I mean, that's, there's that history, but there's also just my own experience as a rank and file member in the building trades where, yeah, I mean, as far as the earlier, the points of don't, if you fight the bosses and improve your conditions in any way, they'll leave. Those are the same, these arguments being made by the bosses, by their politicians, and then unfortunately, my own union leadership in the Ironworkers, in my Ironworkers Local, used the same arguments around, if we don't side with the richest man in the world and oppose taxing big business, that Seattle will be phrases like bread lines and soup kitchens were used. That we would all be put out of work. Seattle would be the next Detroit, so actually quite relevant to the auto industry, right? Like Seattle will be the next Detroit if we don't just let the bosses do whatever they want. And something that's dangerous with these arguments of like, you know, let big business do whatever it wants, and the more profitable they are, and the worse the conditions are for workers, somehow that's how how we in the long run benefit. Is that these arguments can be turned around where Seattle had the highest cost of living increases, housing increases year over year for a decade, and that someone could take the same logic and point it at building trades workers and go, yeah, the reason why housing's so expensive is because these union building trades workers make so much money. And none of us, you ask any of the guys in my union or really any union worker on a job site, hey, how was your last contract? They'll say it was a pile of shit, and that they haven't been getting paid enough to even live in the city that they're working. And yeah, similar with why I can say that with outside of the ironworkers was the experience from the carpenter strike, where you had
And this was in 2021.
The carpenter strike in 2021 was you had a leadership that was tried to push through. They were encouraging a yes vote on 5 TAs, and it was when the members had been organizing rallies outside of the contractors' offices and organizing a no vote campaign, and that there was that fifth rejection that triggered a strike. That it was this was not a sustainable situation, right? For the leadership to go, no, just vote for this, just vote for this. And for the member to be saying, no, absolutely not, and that there's a point where you need to step forward and strike, and that the leadership then it was like, okay, well, if we're going to be forced to strike, we're going to sabotage this strike, and that was where they only wanted to picket 5 jobs in the entire like western half of the state.
And I think this relates to your earlier point also, Logan. You're talking about how the representatives of the working class should be only taking the average worker's wage. And part of the problem, it's obviously not the entire story, but part of the problem where you have this a whole section of union leadership that is so out of touch with the rank and file members of the union is that they don't need a better contract because they have 6-figure salaries for the most part, while the members that they're supposed to represent are struggling to get by.
Oh, absolutely. That was actually, what was it? I think it was our last contract for Local 86 was members were pushed hard on, if you can't make it on 40, then like you need to get your own finances in order. Like this is great. This is a great pay increase. You guys are whiners, blah, blah, blah. You should just work for this company that provides a 401k if you're so upset about the pension. And so, yeah, apparently that was the contract was totally acceptable. But then months after we had gotten that contract, and the union leadership's pay there is a thread connecting their pay to ours because they get paid an X amount above journeyman scale. Among a number of other benefits. And so there was actually like where our shitty contract was holding back their wages. And so then they pushed hard to have the bylaws changed to let that leash out a bit so that they could get farther ahead from us. And they cited increased costs in the construction industry. And it was just just such a slap in the face that it was like, no, this contract for you is great, and fuck you if you don't like it. And then they turn around months later and go, actually, no, that sucked, and we need more money. So yeah, I mean that was and just the whole thing was a real eye-opening experience, because there's just no way that somebody pull a stunt like that and be like, yeah, I sincerely represent you.
I remember talking to carpenters on that picket line in 2021 who had moved an hour or more outside of Seattle to be able to find housing that they could afford to live in, only to find that the cost of gas and parking from having to drive into the city every day was eating up what they had saved in rent. And just that, complete out of touch of the, union officials who don't have any idea, about what it actually takes to try to survive as a working person on the wages that the workers are making.
Exactly.
I remember also on that picket line, Shama, you were the only elected representative in Seattle who was actually supporting the striking carpenters. Not a single one of the other city council members, who are all Democrats, would come out and support the carpenters because they didn't want to threaten their relationships with the union leadership, who, as Logan said, were trying to undermine the strike. And so, Shama, you came down to the picket line. You were talking with carpenters on the picket line. And I remember you having a conversation with a proud, self-proclaimed Trump supporter who said he never thought in his life that he would ever find himself on the same side as a socialist, but he respected you, and he respected so much that you were willing to take a stand against the union bureaucracy and come down and, publicly throw your lot in, use your profile to help support the workers. And I remember him shaking your hand and saying that, you had changed his mind. I believe he said something along the lines of, if this is what socialism is, then it's okay with me.
Yeah, he said something like that. And he was contrasting the approach that we used as a socialist elected representative to all these Democrats, as you were saying, who were siding with unfortunately, the union leadership that was not actually supporting this strike.
That's right. And Logan, I know you yourself also are a socialist, and I assume that has to do with these experiences that you've had as a worker and a rank and file union member. Can you talk a little bit about, why you're a socialist, and also a bit about the history of socialism in the labor movement?
Oh yeah, that's that's one of that's one of my favorite topics. Yeah, the whole history of the labor movement. Most of its biggest victories is tied in with socialist ideas. So from the time that the first rural workers were forced off the land to work in factories that they didn't own, a class consciousness is developed in which workers become aware of the fact that their labor is used to enrich their bosses, not themselves or their families. And historically, the most developed socialist thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels also recognized the imperative to fight racism as well. Marx famously noted that workers can never be free so long as slavery existed. They were in Britain at the time of the American Civil War, but they organized workers in the English cotton factories to join in the fight to prevent England from supporting the Confederacy. In a January 1861 letter to Engels, written after the election of Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln, Marx wrote, quote, "In my opinion, the biggest things that are happening in the world today are, on the one hand, the movement of the slaves in America started by the death of John Brown, and on the other, the movement of the serfs in Russia," end quote. The end of the Civil War saw an explosion of union activity, including the first serious battles for the 8-hour day. But in a historical tragedy that we're still paying for today, the Democrats who ruled the South, let's not forget that the Democratic Party was the party of the slaveholders. Having fought to prevent the legal emancipation of their enslaved workers, also fought to overturn that emancipation with the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws. The Republicans, which of course was Abraham Lincoln's party, betrayed the principles they claimed to stand for and gave in to this, cementing racist ideas into the laws and the social and economic structures of both North and South. And in an equally horrific betrayal, large parts of the labor leadership went along with this. Throughout the history of the labor movement, one of the most important roles of genuine socialists within that movement has been to fight against all kinds of oppressions, racial oppression, gender oppression, and like anti-immigrant chauvinism. And inseparably, we have always fought for a class analysis and against the idea that there can be any community of interest between the bosses and the workers that they exploit. We relentlessly point out that our labor is the only source of their profits, and that we should be demanding all of it, not just whatever crumbs that they're willing to give up, without a serious fight. That we need a different kind of society based on the needs of ordinary people. We need an end to the rule of the bosses. The companies need to be taken over and run by and for the workers within an economy that's run rationally, democratically, and sustainably on a global basis. That's what socialism is. Socialists were involved in setting up the first attempt to build industrial unions. the IWW, or Industrial Workers of the World, later known as the Wobblies. The men who founded the IWW were pioneer industrial unionists, and the great industrial unions of today stem directly from them. But they aimed far beyond industrial unionism as a bargaining agency, recognizing the private ownership of industry as right and unchangeable. The author of those lines, James Cannon, went on to become a founding member of the Communist Party and later of the First American Trotskyist Party. This party then led one of the key strikes in Minneapolis in 1934 that sparked the revolt against the conservative labor leadership that needed to happen before the mass strikes and factory occupations that created the modern labor movement that we have known today, including in particular the UAW. The famous General Motors sit-down strike in the bitter winter of 1936 over to 37, which won the first contract in the auto industry, was organized and led every step of the way by socialists and communists. The organizing drive of long-distance trucking into the Teamsters Union was led by a Trotskyist, Farrell Dobbs, a veteran of that Minneapolis general strike. So yeah, and of course, as a longshoreman, you got Harry Bridges. He's a founder of the ILWU, and he was a socialist, came out of the IWW, and yeah, helped lead the West Coast waterfront strike also in 1934. At every major turning point in labor history, you'll see socialists and others who reject the capitalist system at the heart of those battles because they have a clear understanding of class struggle and have learned the lessons of past battles of the working class. They understand that we have to reject the inequality and exploitation of class society, and that all of this is essential for understanding how to fight and win. Socialists also understand the struggle for better conditions and for a better society, that it has to be a fight of the whole working class. We can't allow ourselves to be divided, to just keep like a narrow focus of, my craft or my union or my workplace, but rather we need to be internationalists. And that's why it's crucial that the labor movement not stand aside from the fight to end the genocidal war by the Israeli state right now against the people of Gaza, which is backed up financially and politically by President Biden and U.S. imperialism. That's why we in Workers Strike Back are calling on unions to build for a national day of action, to go on strike in solidarity with the student movement organizing against the war on Gaza. And so this is what it's going to take to end the war, shutting down the profits of the capitalists.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Logan, for being with us again here today on Strike, and we look forward to having you on again in the future.
Yeah, no, it's been great. Thanks for having me.
If you've watched On Strike before, you'll know that we provide an analysis from the point of view of working class people about the problems we face in our daily lives under capitalism. In every episode, On Strike also presents a strategy for working class movements to fight back. On Strike talks about why it's crucial that every fight for change emphasizes the need to build working class solidarity and is linked with organizing a powerful challenge to the political establishment and the capitalist system itself. This is something you won't find on mainstream media. That's why we need your support for On Strike. Subscribe to our On Strike channel on YouTube and like this video. And become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement. By becoming a Workers Strike Back member, you can also help this broadcast. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people. Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Solidarity.